unregistered arrival at Baltimore Customs House, Jan. 1858. On the morning of January 19th, 1858. A light snow fell in slow, deliberate patterns over Baltimore's Commerce Street, muting the sound of wagon wheels and dampening the usual shuffle of dockside trade. The Customs House, an austere Greek Revival structure, stood against the gray harbor sky like a judgment in stone, its fluted columns wearing a crust of ice from the night's freezing rain. Inside, clerks in dark frock coats warmed their hands over tea kettles and fussed with ledgers, preparing for another day of import tallies and maritime bond clearances. It was here, amid the daily rhythm of ink and parchment, that the first unrecorded anomaly slipped quietly into federal history. She appeared without announcement, without purpose, and without a name. An unknown woman in a dark wool cloak standing just inside the south entrance as if she had always belonged there. The intake books for that day contain no mention of her. No visitor's log bears her description. No complaint was filed about a loiterer. No notation of her departure exists. And yet more than one clerk later swore to having seen her that morning. Gloves soaked through boots mismatched her hair, pinned in a way both precise and careless. She spoke to no one, but when her gaze settled on junior intake clerk Elias M. Greavves, it lingered with the patience of someone waiting for an answer already given. She returned the next day, and the day after that, always before the offices opened, always choosing the same bench beneath the eastern vestibule windows. No formal inquiry was made. Why would there be? She had committed no infraction, trespassed on no restricted record. And yet her absence from the official paper trail was more disturbing than her presence. In the bureaucratic world of 1850s, Baltimore to not exist on paper was an impossibility. Her very omission was its own statement, as if the city's ink had chosen to bypass her entirely. Early disruptions in records. By February, something stranger began to develop. Elias, 26 years old, newly reassigned from Annapolis after the death of his father, was unremarkable in every way that mattered to a government office. Steadfast, deferential, even-tempered, he possessed the sort of personality that drew little notice, except for an old habit of volunteering for duties beyond his rank. That habit perhaps explained why he was the first to begin quietly rechecking his ledgers in the weeks following the woman's arrival. At first the changes were subtle, a date inverted here, a surname spelled in a manner he did not remember, a correction neatly inserted in handwriting indistinguishable from his own. But the anomalies escalated. One afternoon he found a tariff note already entered for a vessel that had not yet docked. Another morning he discovered his own handwriting on an inspection summary, drafted days before the inspection had taken place. Colleagues dismissed it as fatigue. Clerical work was exacting after all, but Elias began to keep his own private notes. "It is all my ink," he wrote in one margin, "but not my thinking." Within 6 months, the bureaucratic tangle deepened. Asylum logs in Boston listed the woman as his legal ward. A boarding house ledger in Baltimore described her as his fiancée. And most unsettling of all, 2 separate death ledgers recorded Elias M. Greavves as deceased, buried in 2 different cemeteries on the same day. Both signatures in those death records matched perfectly. Neither corpse resembled him. Atmosphere and setting. The Baltimore Customs House was built to project the dignity and permanence of federal authority. Its marble floors echoed with each measured step, and the smell of ink-damp wool and coal smoke seemed embedded in the very air. Gaslight filtered down through the clear-story windows, casting a muted glow on rows of mahogany counters where civil clerks worked in deliberate silence. For Elias, the environment was both comfort and cage, a place where the rules of order, record, and routine governed every hour. His desk faced a long interior corridor that funneled toward the main portico, and from that vantage he could see the woman each morning as she seated herself in her chosen place. The harbor's wind often carried through the vestibule, rattling the glass panes and lifting stray strands of her hair. She never read the paper she carried, never glanced toward other clerks. Her gaze remained fixed on Elias, as constant and unyielding as the ticking of the quarter-hour bell. In the weeks after her arrival, the customs house began to feel subtly altered. The usual banter between clerks diminished. Footsteps softened when passing her bench. She was not disruptive, on the contrary. She was stillness itself, but that stillness seemed to reach into the rhythm of the building, slowing it, recentering it around the invisible axis between her eyes and Elias's desk, her daily presence. It is difficult to convey just how completely she inserted herself into the architecture of Elias's days without ever crossing the boundaries of propriety. Each morning she arrived before the great oak doors were unbolted. She would slip in on the wake of a porter's key and seat herself on the same worn bench, hands folded neatly in her lap posture, composed but not rigid. Her cloak, though serviceable, seemed made to draw in light rather than reflect it, rendering her figure almost part of the vestibule's shadowed stone. The other clerks, prone to crude nicknames, began referring to her as the widow of the staircase, a private joke that never reached Elias's ears. If he noticed, he gave no sign. He spoke to her only once on the first day, when he offered her shelter from the snow and a cup of tea from an upstairs station reserved for senior officers. She had accepted the tea without a word, only a small, measured smile. After that, their exchange became one of pure observation, her eyes following his movements. His gaze, when it met hers, held just long enough to acknowledge, and then return to his work. And yet colleagues began to note changes. Elias's work grew more meticulous, his breaks shorter. He no longer lingered in conversation. It was as though her silent watch had pressed him into a tighter mold of himself, and he could not or would not step outside it. Ledger anomalies. Begin. The first real alarm, if it can be called, that came in the form of marginalia. One of Elias's ledgers, now preserved in the Burnham Annex of the National Archives, contains an invoice log for the SS Tilford, dated January 22nd. In the margin, in handwriting, unmistakably his own, appears a note written 3 days before the invoice was officially filed. The window only matters if she's in it. In another place, she's correcting me from before. No one could explain the entries. The customs house operated under strict access controls, and the ledger in question had been locked in a side cabinet accessible only to Elias. A junior staffer concerned about his well-being quietly suggested he take leave. But no formal report was filed. The woman had spoken to no one, touched nothing, and according to the rigid definitions of bureaucracy, had done nothing at all. And yet the corrections kept appearing. Dates shifted backward. Inspections were recorded before they occurred, and names were spelled in ways that suggested foreknowledge rather than error. Elias began checking his books compulsively, tracing each line with his fingertip as if testing its reality. When asked about it, he said only, "It's all my ink, but not my thinking." The phrasing was odd enough to be remembered, though at the time no one understood how much stranger things would become. First note from himself. On the morning of January 27th, Elias arrived at his desk to find something waiting beneath the blotter, a single slip of foolscap, the kind used for quick internal memoranda folded once. When he opened it, the words were simple, almost banal, but carried the kind of weight that grows heavier the more you look at them. You needn't offer again. I'm already home. The handwriting was his down to the compressed capitals and the slight tremor in the descenders, but the sentiment was not. He had never written such a line, nor could he recall even thinking it. There was no signature, no date, no departmental heading to suggest it had been sent through any official channel. He did not mention it to anyone. Instead, over the next 3 days, co-workers noted him quietly reorganizing his desk drawers, matching their layout exactly to the front reception counter where the woman sat each morning. The inkwell normally kept to his right was moved to the left. He began writing with his offhand, his penmanship slower, but oddly more confident, claiming the alignment calmed him. When asked by a fellow clerk, alignment with what he did not answer. The act might have been dismissed as eccentricity, yet the correlation was unmistakable. As his desk mirrored hers, his attention seemed more attuned to her presence, as though the simple geometry of space could draw their two positions into some hidden symmetry. Steady handwriting. Shifts. By early February, fragments of her presence began surfacing in the paperwork of others. In a weekly staff bulletin beside Elias's name in the duty roster, a correction appeared not to the spelling, but to the script. The amendment read simply, "Her handwriting is steadier than mine, written in ink that did not match the ledger's standard supply." No one admitted to writing it. The archivists who later examined the document noted that the line strokes were neither tentative nor rushed. They possessed the unwavering pressure of a practiced hand. Meanwhile, sketches of the woman began turning up during idle moments of the day, drawn by different clerks on scrap paper. Each sketch was more accurate than the last, as though the image of her were refining itself in the collective memory. None of these drawings was signed or dated, but the consistency of detail, the slight lift at one corner of her mouth, the way her cloak's hood fell back just far enough to frame her hair, suggested a shared template. Elias never commented on the sketches, though. One anonymous account from the period claimed he once stopped mid-sentence during ledger work to trace a fingertip along the edge of one such drawing before returning to his task without a word. Predictive ledger entries. The incident that first drew official notice occurred on March 12th. That morning, the local signal station recorded a coastal storm rolling into Baltimore. But in the quiet of his private side cabinet, Elias found something more unsettling than the weather, a ledger entry concerning the SS Valam, a ship that had not yet arrived in port. The entry, dated February 26th, 3 weeks prior, contained precise inspection. Details hull damage near the starboard bow, unpaid tariffs from Charleston, and a notation reading "No flag displayed upon arrival." When the Valam docked on March 1st, every detail matched. Elias submitted a written statement to the Civil Maritime Board, claiming he must have copied it from a memorandum, though he could not recall when or from whom. His handwriting, he admitted, appeared more confident than I am accustomed to. That phrasing concerned the reviewers, prompting a discreet peer check of his past year's ledgers. In 3 separate books they found similar discrepancies, entries recorded before events occurred. corrections without signatures, and references to records not yet in existence. Each anomaly shared the same hand his own, but different. Left-handed writing and no-access breach. During this internal review, a more curious detail emerged. The disputed entries were written from the left-hand margin inward, completely reversed from Elias's known right-handed style. There were no telltale smudge marks, no ink blots or hesitations, as if the lines had been executed in a single uninterrupted motion. This was not forgery in the usual sense. The penmanship was too exact, too fluent in his idiosyncrasies. No other clerk had access to his cabinet. The key logs confirmed it, and yet the entries had been made. When questioned, Elias appeared calm if a little distracted, and stated only, "If it's my hand, it's my hand, but it isn't my moment." The committee could not resolve the contradiction. Their final internal note, never meant for public record, described the matter as self-approximation, a replication without evident forger. This term would never appear again in any official file. Still, those who worked closest to Elias began to look for subtle tells. The angle of his writing, the steadiness of his hand on a damp day, whether his pen was held in the right or left. They found no consistency, except that more and more his documents seemed to bear the invisible weight of two separate authors working in perfect imitation. Unnamed in logs, but ever present. By mid-March, the woman had become part of the customs house itself. She was never listed in the building's daily guest tallies, never appeared in internal memos, never signed a visitor's log. Yet her presence was verifiable through secondary traces, brief mentions in corridor duty reports, a note in the porter's book that she was in vestibule, as before unsigned annotations in margin notes that seemed to refer to her without using a name. On one occasion, the porter, Mr. Langdon, was asked to record her in an incident log as per office policy for loiterers. He left the name field blank. The paper was later found with the faint graphite inscription, Monsieur Greavves, written in a hand not his own. Around the same time, a transfer request appeared on Elias's desk, moving him from Baltimore to the Office of Lighthouse Appropriations in Philadelphia. It bore his name, his appointment code, and his signature, but was written in his offhand. Elias denied submitting it. The request was stamped approved and then abruptly stalled, though no one could say by whom. As far as the building was concerned, she still didn't exist. But in the slow accrual of these peripheral details, her absence on paper began to feel like a kind of authorship in itself, as if she were writing herself into the negative spaces of the record, one omission at a time. Letters from multiple cities. In early April, a new pattern emerged, as though the boundaries of the customs house were no longer sufficient for whatever tied Elias and the unnamed woman together. On a damp Monday morning, the porter left a small stack of mail on his desk, 5 envelopes in total. At first glance, they appeared routine. His name written with meticulous care, Elias Matthew Greavves, every letter perfectly formed, each capital G, looping in the way only his own hand could produce. The envelopes varied in paper stock and tint cream pale blue ivory, but all were sealed in the same manner, a crescent of wax pressed flat without emblem. The postmarks, however, told an impossible story. One from Savannah, dated April 2nd, another from Pittsburgh, April 4th. Then Trenton Mobile and Wilmington, spanning April 6th to 10th. The dates were tight, geographically unreasonable, unless a single traveler had moved faster than the rail lines themselves allowed, Witnesses in each of those cities, station masters, hotel clerks would later claim without prompting to have glimpsed a woman matching her description. Quiet, solitary, always near a threshold, but never crossing it. Inside the envelopes, the handwriting was his identical in every way. The first 3 letters were bureaucratic in tone, almost dull. A missed appointment at the tax inspector's office, a note on bridge-toll discrepancies in Pittsburgh, a list of quiet boarding houses in Baltimore. But beneath the formality, a current began to show. The 4th letter read, "They do not see me the way you did. You recognize the part I left inside you. I left it years ago. You've only now begun to feel it shift." The 5th had no salutation, no signature, only the sentence, "You are where I belong." Elias told no one. The letters disappeared into his desk drawer, but colleagues began to notice him pausing mid-task, his pen hovering above the page, as though he were waiting for a hand over his own to guide the next stroke. Elias's behavioral shifts. By mid-April, his behavior had altered in ways subtle but undeniable. Mr. Arlen Deem, a fellow clerk, recorded in an archived letter dated April 14th that Elias seemed preoccupied with out-of-state postings despite having no pending assignments. During idle hours, he no longer jotted calculations or copied forms for practice. Instead, he wrote in repetition short phrases in faint pencil until they filled the blotter's edge. Deem claimed to have counted a particular line more than 36 times. "I've already answered her, but not aloud." The words, when Elias was confronted, drew only a mild, almost indulgent smile, as though the matter was private and harmless. But there was a growing estrangement between the man and his work. He began placing his inkwell at the very edge of the desk, as if to make space for another writer. His correspondence slowed to a trickle, and when it did arrive, the tone was curiously impersonal. Letters to his sister in Annapolis referred to himself in the 3rd person, describing his habits and appearance as though he were an acquaintance rather than a brother. The culmination came when he formally applied to have his handwriting on file with the civil office, recertified citing mimicry by unknown parties. The request was denied, but the denial itself carried an oddity. The postmark was dated April 10th, 1 day before Elias claimed to have sent the application. Multiple sightings in other cities. The letters had already suggested a widening circle, but now official documents began corroborating what had once seemed rumor. Personnel records from Charleston's Customs Depot contained a grain inspection ledger, signed E.M. Greavves, on March 19th. The same week, Richmond's Dock Inspection Office filed an adjustment form for scales bearing his name and correct appointment code. Both documents were verified by senior clerks, who claimed to have spoken briefly with Mr. Greavves, a quiet man with thin spectacles. Elias, however, did not own spectacles and had not left Baltimore. The signatures were almost perfect, but analysts noted subtle inconsistencies. A hesitation in the lower loop of the S, as if begun with the opposite hand and corrected mid-stroke. Over an 11-day span, 5 such signatures appeared across 3 cities, during which Elias was documented at his Baltimore desk without absence. When confronted, he did not deny the signatures outright. Instead, he said, "I believe my style is being approximated, not forged, approximated." The distinction unsettled his superiors. Approximation implied cooperation, or at least an openness in the boundaries of his identity. Committee review. Faced with these anomalies, the Baltimore office convened a quiet, internal review. No formal accusations, no public notice. 3 committee members examined disputed signatures alongside Elias's confirmed work. The differences were minute but persistent slight shifts in capitalization and economy of motion that lacked his usual pauses. A misdirected envelope from the Philadelphia Stamp Authority was also produced. Inside was a routine requisition order, unsigned, but in a hand that perfectly matched his earliest training samples from Annapolis. At the top, faintly in pencil, was a single line Greavves emission everywhere. No department claimed authorship. The phrase was archived without comment, though its placement implied it had been written after the requisition, not before. The review ended with no disciplinary action. Officially, the matter was left unresolved, but privately the members began referring to the case as the duplication problem. First, asylum link. The first connection between the woman and an institution came via a ledger from Massachusetts General Hospital. Dated late April, it recorded the admission of a female patient listed only as E.M., with no surname, occupation, or kin, except for one detail under next of kin. The entry read, Elias M. Greavves, attending physician. The notation was precise down to his place of birth and age, as well as a registry number belonging to a federal clerk in Baltimore, a number that no one in Boston could have known. Days later, an intake ledger from the New York State Hospital in Albany recorded a Margaret G. admitted under Elias's name as the authorizing official. Her vital signs were described as calm, responsive, highly observant. The signature at the bottom matched his exactly, though handwriting analysts noted a lighter pen pressure and a subtle leftward lean traits, consistent with non-dominant hand replication. When shown these records, Elias asked for duplicate copies, examined them in silence, and requested leave, citing mental fatigue brought on by unresolved matters of identity. He offered no further explanation. Unsigned letter. It arrived without ceremony, no return address, no postage mark, slipped into the internal mail pouch that circulated between departments like an artery. The envelope was plain cream-colored and bore only Elias's name in a firm, deliberate script. Elias M. Greavves. When he opened it, the sheet inside was equally unadorned. Bonded linen paper, perfectly folded, containing just one sentence. You're not mistaken, but you are duplicated. The handwriting was flawless, matching his own to the last curve of the G, the precise pressure in the downstrokes. Elias read it once then again before folding it neatly and placing it in his breast pocket. That afternoon, without a word to anyone, he burned it in the customs house hearth. The janitor sweeping near the door later recalled that Elias did not look distressed, only resigned, as though the message had confirmed something long suspected. Weeks later, a passenger manifest from Wilmington surfaced, noting a traveler under the name Dr. E.M. Greavves, destination Boston. In the margin, someone had written in a pencil already accounted for. No one claimed the notation. The pencil was of a type not kept in the Wilmington station. These small marks, these ephemeral notes in the margins of official documents, began to feel like a secondary system of record, a shadow bureaucracy charting the movements of two people who shared one name. Absence of a name as impossibility. In the world of mid-19th century bureaucracy, the absence of a name was not merely an omission, it was a nullity. Names determined salaries, housing rights, travel permissions. Without one, you did not officially exist. And yet in the Baltimore Customs House between May and June of 1858, the unnamed woman appeared everywhere except where she should have been listed. She was absent from the visitor logs, from the guest tallies, from the dormitory rosters. But in the periphery, casual mentions in corridor duty reports, unsigned marginal notes, her presence was undeniable. On May 9th, Porter F. Tilburn noted in the daily entry, Greavves EM1 visitor log, followed by the phrase, hand-delivered by same. The handwriting in the remarks was unfamiliar, almost delicate. That same day, a mail slip for a parcel addressed to Elias bore the line received by recipient's guest. No sender was listed, no description of contents. Elias denied receiving such a parcel, but later that week his personal quartering log included a hand-drawn sketch of his room with the bed moved closer to the corner and an adjacent cot marked unused but acknowledged. To the clerks, she became shorthand, the witness his reflection, the woman from the door. Everyone seemed to remember her, but no two could agree on what she looked like. Note, beneath blotter. On a warm June morning, while replacing blotting paper on Elias's desk, a junior clerk found a folded scrap tucked beneath it. The ink was faint, the strokes thin as though the pen had been pressed to the page only long enough to leave a shadow. The message read, "If you do not give her a name, she will borrow yours." There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Elias's, except that it was mirrored, written right to left in perfect reversal. To write so legibly in reverse would have required careful practice, yet the flow of the letters suggested fluency, not labor. The clerk returned the note to its place without comment. When archivists examined it decades later, they noted the unusual paper stock low-rag content, coarse more commonly used for seamstress order slips than for office correspondence. As with so many artifacts from this period, no one could trace where it had come from or who had first placed it there. The Coat Commission. If the woman's presence had until now been primarily in the intangible, name's handwriting marginalia, then the coat was her first indisputable artifact. In a seamstress's ledger from Richmond, dated May 29, 1858, appears an order under the name Miss Greavves, placed by a male client, identified only as betrothed. The garment described a custom ash-gray wool coat with plum silk lining cut with broad shoulders, but narrow hips. Not typical for a woman's coat, yet not fully a man's either. The seamstress, Adelaide Moore, noted final stitching requested without internal tags. Client cited aversion to identification. Payment was in coin. The receipt still preserved was signed EMG Givens. When questioned years later, Moore described the fitting, "It hung perfectly on the man who brought her. Suited him like it had known him longer than I had. There was no affection between them. Something worse, something decided." Decades later, the coat surfaced in a Baltimore storage attic among unclaimed personal effects. Inside the lining, pinned into the seam, was a note. "This was made to fit the part of me that answers to her." Ink analysis revealed 2 layers. One visible, one faint and reversed, traced as though by the point of a needle. The coat in Moore's final inventory was listed simply as returned, never collected. Quiet federal inquiry. By late June, the anomalies surrounding Elias had grown too persistent for quiet dismissal. The Bureau of Maritime Operations initiated a discreet internal inquiry, not punitive, but preservational. Proceedings were held in a third-floor chamber of the Customs House, a dim, seldom-used room lined with nautical maps and brass fixtures dulled by gas smoke. Elias was presented with documents bearing his signature in ink, identical to his own, but dated and phrased in ways he did not remember. One was an approval form for a personnel transfer to Richmond dated March 11th. Another, a mail ledger, routing a parcel from the Albany Asylum to the Baltimore archives, bore his name twice, once as authorizing clerk, once as recipient. "I know the weight of my own pen," he told the panel, "but the thoughts behind it, those were not mine." At first, the inquiry leaned toward compassion, overwork fatigue. But when a seventh document emerged, a federal census schedule for Ohio, co-signed Messrs. Greavves in an identical hand, only lighter, the tone shifted. Reviewers noted that the disputed documents were stripped of personality, procedural, efficient without flourish. "Not forgeries," one member wrote in a private note. Reduction of style. The more the review committee handled the disputed documents, the more they realized the strangeness was not only in their provenance, but in their tone. Elias's authentic work bore his personality in small, almost unconscious flourishes. A comma curled just so, an extra line in the G, the habit of adding clarifying comments in the margin. The questioned documents, by contrast, were stripped bare, perfectly correct procedurally, immaculate but cold. They were the skeleton of his style without the living tissue. One committee member described them as instructions without an author, and another more bluntly as the form without the man. There were no smudges, no ink density, changes from fatigue or haste, no evidence of hesitation before difficult words. The spacing between letters was mathematically uniform, as though plotted rather than written. The panel's private minutes record an unorthodox conclusion: these are not forgeries, but reductions. As if the pen had been guided by a hand that knew the motions, but not the mind. Elias read the minutes when they were quietly shown to him. He did not dispute the assessment. Instead, he said in a voice described as even but drained, "They are mine when I am not there." Baltimore Asylum Intake Anomaly. The second quarter ledger of the Baltimore Asylum for Women was a model of order, linen-bound, copper-tagged, written in the steady iron gall script of trained nurses. Page 143, however, bore an anomaly that archivists would puzzle over for decades. Dated April 23rd, it listed a female patient with no proper name. Under legal guardian or assigned custodian ward of E.M. Greavves. 2 lines below, under known affiliation or domestic partner of same. Both entries were in the same fine slanted script consistent with the woman's known hand. The implication was unsettling custody, and intimacy collapsed into a single claim on one man. She was admitted without incident, carrying only an empty satchel, and when asked to identify herself, she said, "He will correct the spelling." A week later, in the nurse's margin, notes a new line appeared: verified presence of subject. Greavves. There was no signature. Decades later, when archivists tried to photograph the page, the camera failed to register the ink. Under light, the entries seemed to vanish, leaving a pale smear of absence where her name or lack of one should have been. The page had been treated with an unknown varnish that resisted aging. The same varnish, when tested, matched a faint note found folded into the ledger's back. You do not admit someone like her. You accept she was always listed. Sketch of 2 faces. On June 18th, the boarding porter delivered an envelope to Elias's room. No seal, no name, only a pencil line drawn with ruler precision across its center. Inside was a sheet of sketch paper, water-worn at the corners. 2 portraits were drawn in ink. The first was unmistakably Elias Angular, brow narrow jaw, lips pressed in the familiar line of concentration. The second portrait mirrored the first in bone structure, but softened the features, rounder, jaw-wider eyes, hair tucked under a lace bonnet. Beneath each face was a single word, me, one below the male, one below the female. In the lower right corner, faint in a pencil, was a date, March 3rd, 1856, 2 years before the woman's first recorded appearance in Baltimore. At that time, Elias had been recovering from what his personal journals called a crowded mind episode in Annapolis. Analysts debated the sketch for years. Was it a self-portrait in two forms? Was it drawn by her, by him, or by some third hand that knew them both? When shown the paper during a wellness evaluation, Elias did not ask who had drawn it. He asked, when? Mirror, avoidance, and room. Mirroring. After receiving the sketch, Elias's behavior shifted in small but telling ways. He stopped using the mirror above his washstand, covering it with muslin. He turned his coat collar up even indoors. More curiously, he rearranged his quarters to mirror the layout of the adjoining room 6, which had been vacant since May, its key missing. Bed to the east wall desk beneath the left window, wash basin on the right. When asked why, he said, she occupies it when I am asleep. There was no record of any person entering room 6, yet Elias insisted it was not empty. The porter noted in his log that Elias paused before doorways as if waiting for permission from someone unseen. He also began taking 2 cups of tea at breakfast, setting one on the corner of his desk. It remained untouched, but he refilled it daily. These rituals were never explained. Earlier, boarding house entry. The ledger of Miss Edith Calloway's boarding house, kept with meticulous care, contained an impossibility. On page 32, dated March 1858, 1 month before Elias's documented move to Baltimore, appeared the entry, Greavves E.M. Room 7, paid 3 weeks in advance. Miss Calloway swore in a later affidavit that the tenant was a woman who identified herself only as Miss Greavves, and said, he'll join me shortly. She stayed 3 days, rearranging furniture, tilting the mirror lining the wardrobe with new paper. When Elias arrived in April, Miss Calloway greeted him as a returning lodger. He seemed confused, but when shown room 7, remarked only that it was already made to suit me. Bed facing east desk, beneath the left window, preferences he had never voiced aloud. In the wardrobe drawer was a cobbler's receipt dated February 4th. Greaves for lady with shoe measurements that did not match Elias's. On the wallpaper behind the wardrobe, faint pencil outlined the shadow of a torso, male but smaller than Elias, no head, just shoulder to hip. Beneath it, 6 pressure marks in the floor where a trunk had once rested. Elias later told investigators, I never wrote that entry, but I remember being inside it. Physical traces in room 7. The peculiarities of room 7 did not end with the ledger entry. When federal archivists inspected the space during the inquiry, they found signs of deliberate occupation that predated Elias's arrival. The wallpaper behind the wardrobe bore a faint, almost hesitant pencil outline of a body shoulder to hip male in proportion, but smaller than Elias, with no head depicted. The floor beneath showed 6 distinct indentations in the wood, precisely spaced where a heavy trunk had once rested for an extended time. No trunk was ever claimed or recorded in the boarding house's inventory. Inside the washstand drawer, they discovered a cobbler's receipt dated February 4th, issued to Greaves for lady with measurements that aligned closely with Elias's height, but indicated a narrower width as if built for someone almost but not quite his frame. More troubling was the ink. It glowed faintly under chemical separation, a trait linked to a Boston print shop, not to any supplier in Maryland at the time. When confronted with these findings, Elias did not deny them. Instead, he remarked, "I never wrote that order. But I remember the shoes." Such statements became typical, an acknowledgement of memory without ownership, as though his experiences had been pressed into him by another's hand. Elias's reaction. When shown the ledger and the physical evidence from room 7, Elias sat quietly for several minutes, examining each piece with clinical detachment. Witnesses from the committee recall that he neither protested nor defended himself. His only comment, after tracing the faint torso outline on the wallpaper with his fingertip, was, "I never wrote that entry, but I remember being inside it." The remark was unsettling in its phrasing, speaking of a ledger entry, as though it were a room he had physically inhabited. When asked to clarify, he said nothing, simply folded the receipt and returned it to the investigator. The report noted a change in his demeanor afterward. His gaze became more inward, his speech slower, his manner almost meditative. From that day, Elias began carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth, keeping it at his desk and beside his bed. No one saw inside it but a colleague later swore they heard the faint rattle of coins, or perhaps buttons, when it was moved. The parcel was never logged as evidence, nor was it found after Elias's disappearance from official records. Unfiled infirmary report. Among the incomplete archives of the Washington Metropolitan Infirmary for Nervous Complaints, investigators found a single page with no folder, no case notes, and no discharge record. It was dated July 1st, 1858, and at the top, in block print, was patient number 12, Greavves E.M. The first half, in the rounded hand of an institutional physician, described hallucinations of feminine double compulsive mimicry, of absent subject, expressed fear of self-fraud. Midway down, the handwriting changed smaller, more deliberate, adding discharge. Due to over-identification with stalker. Patient may not be originator of symptoms. Pattern resembles parasitic duplication. The term appears in no other known medical record from the period. Stranger still, when the page was held. To lamplight, the top third revealed a reversed imprint of the same text pressed into another surface. In that mirrored version, the word stalker had been replaced with guardian. No duplicate copy was ever found. At the time, Elias had no formal admission record at the infirmary, and yet his correspondence ceased entirely between June 29th and July 3rd, a silence that matched the implied dates of confinement. Disappearing. Week in June. In that missing week, co-workers reported marked changes. Elias spoke in the passive voice when referring to his own actions. It was signed not by me but with me. He began to redact his name from previous documents in graphite, replacing it with the phrase "non-confirmed author" in the margins. On July the 2nd, a copy of the infirmary report appeared in the internal mailroom addressed to Monsieur Greavves in an unfamiliar hand. Attached by a rusted paper clip was a torn slip of paper bearing the line, "The name is correct. The memory is not." In the upper left corner, faintly in graphite, was the number 13, its significance never explained. No one admitted to delivering the envelope, and the paper stock did not match the infirmary's supply. Afterward, Elias seemed reluctant to touch any document requiring his signature, holding the pen poised as though waiting for a second hand to join his before committing ink to paper. Anonymous envelope. The July 1st envelope was plain unsealed, its paper slightly warped from humidity. The handwriting on the front was deliberate but unfamiliar, the strokes narrower than Elias's own. Inside, folded twice, was the infirmary report and the clipped note. What struck the review committee later was that the paper bore two sets of creases, as if it had been folded once by a tall hand and once by a shorter. The note's line, "The name is correct. The memory is not," had been written without hesitation, but the graphite appeared to have been applied over an erased line of identical wording, as though the writer had traced their own hand to reinforce the message. The faint number 13 in the corner became a minor obsession among the archivists. Was it a code? A page reference? A designation in some parallel record? No answers emerged, and the file was ultimately marked as context unavailable. To Elias, however, its meaning seemed clear enough. When asked by a colleague if he understood the number, he replied only, "It's the next one." He did not elaborate. Final leave from Customs House. The last uncontested signature of Elias Matthew Greavves in the Baltimore Customs House Employment Ledger is dated July 9th, 1858. The entry is entirely routine. Leave of absence requested. Reason, personal distress. The form is clean, the stroke steady, and the ink matches the office supply. No annotations, no marginalia, no second hand layered over his. But the very absence of anomaly feels almost deliberate, as if this one document was meant to be unimpeachable. The leave was approved without question, granting him open-ended time away from duty. That evening, Elias boarded the midnight mail train to Philadelphia. The conductor noted he traveled light, no luggage. No coat, just a small pressed envelope under his arm. The weather was unsettled summer storms, dragging wet air along the tracks, slowing travel north. When the train pulled into the city after 3 in the morning, he was observed moving with measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. This was the last time any official federal record would place him in Baltimore employ. From here on, his presence exists only in scattered ledgers, eyewitness recollections, and documents that refuse to settle into a single authorship. Hotel incident, the Ledger House. Hotel near Market Street kept a guest book that doubled as an accounting ledger, neat columns of names, room numbers, rates paid. On July 10th, an entry appeared, Mr. E.M. Greavves and sister. The signature is curious, not entirely Elias's, yet close enough to evade suspicion. The desk clerk, Mr. Barons, testified later that Elias had checked in, accompanied by a woman quiet in her eyes, who offered no name but signed for both. Witnesses disagreed on her age. One chambermaid thought her younger than Elias. Another insisted older, with the calm of someone long accustomed to guiding. She carried no luggage, yet seemed entirely at home in the role of fellow traveler. 12 hours later, Elias was found seated upright in a velvet-backed lobby chair, unconscious, but uninjured hands folded in his lap. Pinned to his coat with a straight pin was a folded note, "Where you go, I go." The handwriting was indistinguishable from his own. The hotel records show no payment for a second guest, yet when staff inspected his room, both sides of the bed were disturbed, and 2 glasses of water sat on the nightstand, one half empty, one untouched. Double bed indentations and mirror etching. The most unusual evidence from the hotel room was the mirror above the vanity. Overnight condensation had formed on the glass, leaving the faint trace of initials EMG. Below, etched shallowly into the glass, not in condensation but scored into the surface, were the same initials again. The depth of the etching suggested a careful, deliberate act, yet no noise of glasswork was reported by nearby guests. The etching matched neither Elias's known pressure patterns nor any common engraving tool mark of the time. It would be kept by the hotel for decades as a curiosity, until cracked during renovations in 1904. Staff swore that the second set of initials looked fresher than the first, as though whoever inscribed them had done so after the condensation had already formed an impossibility without erasing the moisture first. Some believed this proved the initials were left by two different hands. Others, more superstitious, called it a double signing, one for the guest book and one for something else entirely. Admission by non-existent nurse M. Greavves. 2 days later, Elias was back in Baltimore. The commitment record for patient number 72B, Elias Matthew Greavves, appears in the August 1858 registry of the Baltimore Sanitarium for Nervous Disorders. The admitting nurse's name is listed as M. Greavves, R.N. At first glance, it suggested a familial connection, perhaps a sister or cousin. But the sanitarium's head, matron, Sister Elodia, found no record of any nurse by that name, no uniform issued, no badge, no prior employment in any hospital within the district. The badge number listed beside her name traced back not to the sanitarium at all, but to a Baltimore Department of Vital Records file from 1843 labeled Maternity Claim, Minor Guardian, Elias M. Greavves, age 11. The claim described an infant female unnamed with no mother, recorded to be recorded under future designation. There is no indication Elias ever knew of this document. Yet the handwriting on the maternity claim, particularly in the curvature of the G's, bears a quiet echo of the nurse's admission signature in 1858. Behavior in confinement. During his 7 days at the sanitarium, Elias was lucid but disoriented. He told staff he had been accompanied by a nurse who arranged everything, though he never described her appearance in detail. Orderlies reported peculiar habits. He refused meals unless they were served with 2 place settings. He requested his patient charts be written twice, once in his name, once in hers, though he never spoke her name aloud. Each morning, he stood at the window speaking softly to his own reflection, then correcting himself in a lower tone. No visitors were recorded, yet an unsigned log from August 12th lists Greavves twice, once under the patient column, once under the guest column, with the note, "Arrival confirmed." Reconciliation not completed. Patient requires reintegration. The pen used for this note was identified as a red ink formulation common in midwifery wards, not found elsewhere in the sanitarium. On discharge, Elias was returned to his boarding house by cab. The receipt for the fare was signed Monsieur Greavves in a hand indistinguishable from his own, but closer examination revealed it had been traced twice, once forward, once backward over the same line. Unsigned visitor log. The unsigned visitor log from August 12th became one of the more debated pieces of evidence in the Greavves case. Unlike the sanitarium's primary ledgers, this small booklet recorded incidental comings and goings, deliveries, messengers, family visits, often in abbreviated form. The page for that date was otherwise unremarkable. A nurse's cousin bringing fresh linens, a grocer's boy delivering apples. But halfway down, 2 consecutive entries appeared. The first in neat script Greavves, patient. The second directly below in identical script Greavves, guest. The note alongside read, "Arrival confirmed." Reconciliation not completed. Patient requires reintegration. There was no signature, no initials, no department mark. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, too few idiosyncrasies to place firmly in either Elias's or the woman's hand. Stranger still, the pen used left a residue particular to red iron formulations common in midwifery wards, yet no such ink was stocked in the sanitarium. Staff questioned after the fact, either could not remember the entry being made or insisted they had never seen such a note until investigators pointed it out. The physical log has since been lost. Only a photographic plate from 1894 survives, kept in the Burnham Annex archives, its letters crisp as though freshly written. Visitor Log Journal, found in 1873. 15 years after Elias's discharge during a routine clearance of the sanitarium's disused East Wing janitor, Henry Olin discovered a small journal wrapped in twine and muslin wedged behind 2 stone shelves. The cover read, E.M. Greavves, Visitor Log. No such volume existed in official inventories. Inside were 37 entries dated sporadically between 1858 and 1871. Each entry was a brief observation. Observed him pacing corridor again today. He mouths the name before speaking it. Or he requests silence, but only when others are watching. Every entry ended with the same signature, Monsieur Greavves. The handwriting was not Elias's in full, but bore his terminal strokes. His slant, the shallow loop of his capital G, only lighter, as though tracing him rather than forging. No entry recorded a location beyond corridor or ward, yet the tone suggested intimacy, a presence beside him rather than at a remove. Analysts noted that the paper stock matched Albany maternity ward suppliers, not the sanitarium's own. When presented to the head physician, the journal was deemed non-essential and sealed in the 1874 records audit. Final page. The journal's final page was undated. It contained only 1 paragraph. He never wrote me, but he made room in letters, in mirrors, and spaces between names. The archives remember what the mind declines. There was no closing signature. The handwriting on this page was more fluid than the earlier entries, less concerned with mimicking Elias's precise form. Margins widened as the lines progressed, as if the writer had leaned into the act of claiming the page. The ink here tested differently too, a deeper brown with traces of a resin not present in the earlier entries, perhaps indicating a different pen or a later edition. The last sentence. The archives remember what the mind declines was underlined twice, with the second underline faintly offset as though drawn by a hand pressing against the first from beneath the paper. This was the only page in the book that archivists agreed was definitively not written by Elias, though whose hand it was remained as ever undocumented. Scrap in East Wing wall. In 1890, when part of the East Wing was partially demolished, a loose stone was dislodged from the interior wall. Behind it was a scrap of unlined paper pressed flat against the plaster. It bore no date, no signature, only a single line in faint brown ink. I was never admitted, but I never left. Chemical testing showed the ink matched both the Albany maternity ward supply and the sanitarium's own iron gall formulation. The handwriting was a hybrid, certain letters in Elias's style, others in the woman's. The line appeared in no other known document until 1931, when a museum archivist found the same phrase written in pencil on the underside of a desk drawer, salvaged from the Customs House Annex. Next to it, carved into the wood, were 2 initials with no separator, Maj E. The carving was shallow, but deliberate, the kind that could be done slowly over hours without drawing attention. Desk drawer inscription. In 1931, the desk drawer inscription was found during an exhibition refit when the Customs House Annex had long been converted into a maritime museum. The curator at the time, Miss Henrietta Colby, described turning the drawer over to dust it and discovering the faint pencil scrawl already here. Directly beside it, carved so lightly that only a raking light revealed it, were the letters Macabre visitors. In later years speculated it might be a corrupted form of Monsieur Greavves, or an unfinished word. Handwriting experts noted that the pencil strokes of already here bore the rhythm of Elias's hand, but lacked his usual compression between letters, as though written more slowly. The carving's letter spacing, however, matched his perfectly. Whether the two were done by the same person at the same time remains unresolved. The drawer is now stored in the Burnham Annex under controlled conditions, its underside left unclean to preserve the graphite. Final narrator's question. Some files, archivists like to say, are never truly closed. They're simply overwritten, steadier hands replacing weaker ones, quieter names taking the place of those who faltered. The Greavves file is one such case, a sequence of documents, rooms, and recollections where authorship shifts like light through water. Each entry tells the same story in different words, as if the record itself were a living thing, trying on different voices. In the end, you are left with the question that closes the final curatorial report. If you found your name in the wrong place, would you correct it, or would you wait to see who signs it next? No one has ever answered in print, and perhaps that is fitting. In the spaces between names in the margins without signatures, the story of Elias M. Greavves and the unnamed woman remains not concluded, not erased, but poised, pen lifted, waiting for the next hand to take it.